Hello and welcome to my presentation, The Power of Using Images when Teaching the Alexander Technique to Young People. It's part of the Alexander in Education Online Symposium 2020. So my presentation, which will be about 20 minutes long, is divided into two parts. Part 1, Understanding UK law on using images, and Part 2, Why use images when teaching Alexander to young people, with some fun examples. So here we go, Part 1. Understanding UK law on using images. So there is detailed information on image copyright in the UK, which you can find at the Intellectual Property Office website at the web address that I've given there on the right. There is also a very good website on image copyright for the UK. It doesn't have a good web address, so you'll have to Google Thomas Reuters Images Copyright Guide to find it. So let's start with some basics. As soon as someone creates an original work, whether that's a photo or other image, they become the copyright owner. So there we are. I've just done a scribble about 5 minutes ago online, and I've put my name to it, and that is my copyright image. That image belongs to me, and if anyone wanted to use it, they would have to get my permission to use it, unless there's a certain exception, which we'll go into later. I've put my name to it, but you don't have to put your name to it for it to be copyright. I've also used the copyright symbol. You can use that, but it doesn't have any weight in law. It's just a useful extra thing to add so that someone is aware that it's a copyright image. So if you're thinking of using other people's images without permission, the fact is you should really worry about that. It's best not to do it. And the following are not justifications. I didn't know. I found it on someone else's website. Lots of people have already used that image. No one will find out. I added an attribution. These are all excuses, but they are in no way justifications for using an image without permission. The reason for this is only a couple of years ago it was confirmed by the European Supreme Court that even online, if you use an image from someone without permission, you can very easily be sued. So the actual case that went to court is quite interesting. A school had posted an image without permission. In fact, one of the pupils who attended this school in Germany had used the image for one of their projects. It was an image of the Spanish city of Cordova. So they used it with their project, and the school posted this image as part of the project online. And the photographer wasn't very happy about it because it wasn't used for the original purpose that the photographer had intended. And so he was able to sue the school for the use of that image without permission. Now you might think, oh, it's a school, don't they have a kind of educational exception for using images? Well, that is the case, and we're going to look into it in a minute. However, the court decided that in this case the school was using it for commercial purposes to promote the school because it was on their either on their homepage or somewhere else on their website. So this is a really stark warning that you can't just use images with impunity. You need to make sure that you have permission to use them. So going back to that image that I used at first in my presentations, how come I just used that image of a lawyer, which I clearly didn't draw myself? So there are websites such as Pixabay here that allow you to search for an image and then use it in your own commercial website, for example. So these images are free for commercial use. You can see I've put a ring around that, and you don't even need to add an attribution. So these websites such as Pixabay will allow you to find such images, and you can use them wherever you like for commercial or non-commercial purposes. Now, as I just mentioned earlier, there are exceptions to copyright in education and teaching, but you have to be careful. So there is government guidance on this. There's a document on that website at that URL that is useful. It gives you the full information for the exceptions to copyright in education and teaching. So the most relevant exception when using images for educational purposes is when you are using the image to illustrate a point. This is called illustration for instruction in the legislation. In short, you can copy a work in any medium as long as the use is solely to illustrate a point, it is not done for commercial purposes, it is accompanied by sufficient acknowledgement, and the use is fair dealing. So what is fair dealing? You need to ask yourself the following questions. Does using the work affect the market for the original work? If a use of a work acts as a substitute for it, causing the owner to lose revenue, then it is likely not to be fair. Is the amount of the work taken reasonable and appropriate? Was it necessary to use the amount that was taken? Finally, in this regard, there is some guidance in the government document that I mentioned in their FAQ that's very relevant to Alexander teachers. And the FAQ question concerned is this one. I don't work for an educational establishment. Can I use the exception? And the answer is the fair dealing exception applies to acts of instruction in general, not only educational establishments. So that means if you're an Alexander teacher working in a private setting, yes, you can use the educational exception and use it in an appropriate way in your teaching. You can make copies. Finally, in this section, if you're looking for the copyright owner of an image, there are some resources available to you. So, for example, you might have an image that you've come across and you have the image, but you've no idea who owns it or where it came from. If you can upload that image into one of the search engines, either this search engine called TinEye or Google Images, specifically with TinEye, you will be able to find the earliest instance of that image online. It doesn't always work to identify the copyright owner, but it is a useful resource. Google Images does a similar thing, but as far as I can tell, it doesn't actually help you find the earliest instance of the image. So, in conclusion, if you require an image for commercial purposes, such as your website or flyer, then number one, you could use your own photos or images. Number two, you could search websites such as Pixabay. You can use images for free and won't have to attribute them. Number three, you could purchase a license to use an image from a service such as Shutterstock online, and they normally have better images, higher quality images. Or four, you could contact the copyright owner of the image you wish to use and see whether they will grant you a license to use it. And if you want to copy an image for use in your teaching, you can use the illustration for instruction legal exception to copyright. But do remember, one, you need to include an attribution to show where the image came from. And number two, you should make sure that the use is fair dealing. In other words, consider whether your use of the image might cause the owner of the copyright to lose revenue. So that's the end of part one. Now we're going to move on to the fun part, which is part two. So part two, why use images when teaching Alexander to young people? Here are some fun examples. Before we look at the examples, here are some reasons I've come up with why using images is a great resource. So this isn't scientific. I'm sure there is science on why images are so great. These are just some of my own personal reasons. Here they are: exaggeration, caricature, humour, depersonalization, emotion, storytelling, empathy, memorable, complex ideas, comparison, discussion point, jumps the linguistic barrier, and for the purposes of review. So here are 8 examples of images suggesting endgaining. So I use a lot of images in my teaching, and this is just a set of images, not all the images I use by any means, but a set of images that suggest endgaining. And I think there are some particularly powerful ones, which is why I chose that category. So here's the first image. It's actually a poster, and the poster is entitled Homo Computerus. So I think you'll probably agree this is a very striking image, impactful. It's a kind of caricature, and for that reason it's very memorable. But even with students who have no experience of the Alexander technique whatsoever, you can really drill down and start to help them understand where you might be coming from with the technique. You can ask questions such as, how is this Homo Computerus feeling? How did he get into this state? What's going on? Here's another image which might illustrate endgaining. I've mentioned humour in this case because most people, when they see it, they do laugh out loud, or a lot of people do anyway. I've taken this image in a workshop in Romania, and you know, across cultures, this is sort of universally quite funny. So you might obviously ask the question, what's happened or what's going on here? Again, even with students who know nothing about the Alexander technique, it's an interesting way in. And emotions, why is he looking like that? What do you think he feels about what's going on? You know, it's a good way of getting into the emotions of a character. Okay, so for my third image, I have a picture here of Gollum. So Gollum is a character from The Lord of the Rings, and a lot of young people, not everyone these days, but a lot of young people will know about Gollum and Lord of the Rings. So I've used this image, or images like it, really quite a lot in my teaching because, as I say on the right-hand side, it's a great example of storytelling. You can look into the backstory of this character and discover that actually he was a fairly normal character, if you like, one of the river folk. And then he developed an obsession. And if anyone knows The Lord of the Rings, they will know that he was obsessed with the ring. So what happens to him as a result of this obsession? His entire bearing, his attitude, psychologically, physically, emotionally, it changes, and he becomes this kind of monster. So it's a very powerful story, very powerful image, and I think it really epitomizes endgaining. So sometimes I say to my students, you know, we've all got a little bit of Gollum inside of us, and most people kind of recoil with that idea, but it's a very powerful idea all the same. And once you've introduced Gollum in relation to endgaining, most people don't forget endgaining, because you might, for example, review it 6 months later and you say, oh, you know, tell me about endgaining. And they'll go, oh yeah, it's Gollum. Or tell me about Gollum. Oh yeah, endgaining. So there's a very visceral kind of component to using Gollum when talking about endgaining. That's my experience. So here's another image. It's a comparison, and comparisons are really useful. It also encapsulates some emotions, I think. It's a good couple of images to discuss emotions. Emotions are obviously depicted in different ways sometimes, and here you can see with the figure on the left-hand side, you can see what look like a lot of bees or flies buzzing around, but perhaps they're not bees or flies, perhaps they are illustrating a particular emotion, and you might ask your students, well, what's going on there with that emotion, with that person, and how is it affecting their posture, the way they sit at their computer. Here's another image. This is of a flautist. It's a simple line drawing, and I've got the word up there, depersonalized. Now, I think this is quite an interesting aspect of using images. In my experience with young people, teenagers in particular, they can be quite self-conscious. If, on the other hand, you use images, not photographs, but pictures or illustrations, it somehow can take away the personal, the self-conscious aspect of thinking about your own use, which is why I've included it. It's useful in that regard, and it's also useful, this picture, I think, because there are some quite subtle changes or subtle habits of misuse that a student may not notice immediately. But it's a good image, like some other images I use for looking at some more subtle aspects of habit that they may not have considered themselves. So you can see I'm using a lot of images of musicians. That's because it's one of my specialities in the Alexander technique. I've mentioned here talking point and complex ideas. So this is a good image, I think, just to talk about. It's a young guy playing the saxophone, but what do you notice about the way he's standing? Does he stand like a young person, or is there something a little bit more worrying going on? And the shadow is really interesting there. It's almost like a metaphor. It's like saying he's a shadow of the person that he could be. So I think, again, it's a good image for talking about complex ideas. Is he pulling himself down because of the saxophone? Is it because of the saxophone, or is it his own responsibility? What's going on there? Here's another interesting image of a pianist. Again, in my experience, this image is quite good for a talking point. A lot of students, when shown this image, I found, think that he's quite a cool guy, and he does look like quite a cool guy. However, from an Alexander technique perspective, there are some kind of worrying angles going on there, almost a kind of right angle with the neck and the back there. So it becomes an interesting talking point, doesn't it? Do you have to have do you have to have good use in order to play the piano well, or is there a conflict maybe between looking cool and employing some of the principles of the Alexander technique? So it brings up some great issues, some quite deep issues, to talk about such things with your pupils. And finally, this is a couple of my favorite images. These are images drawn by the cellist and pedagogue Christopher Bunting. So again, it's a kind of comparison exercise. And it's a sort of spot the difference, really, and you can ask students to spot the difference. Students of all ages can engage in this kind of spot the difference. There are some quite deep, complex ideas also being expressed, I would say, as well. So have a look at the fingerboard. There don't appear to be any strings on the cello that the left-hand cellist is playing. And he doesn't even have a stool or chair to sit on, and neither is there a floor anywhere to be seen, which is in contrast to the cellist on the right, who has strings, a chair, and the floor. So I'm not going to explain my thinking as to why that might be the case, but it's a really great thing to bring up with students. Why do you think there might not be those items included in the picture on the left? And I've been quite frankly amazed sometimes by the insights that students can have regarding these two pictures. Okay, so that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of the Alexander in Education online symposium. Thank you.